So with all the bank failures that has been happening recently, a question that may be on your mind, as it's been on my mind, is what will happen if JP Morgan fails? Because many of you might be customers of JP Morgan Chase Bank, as I am, and a majority of you might be holding on to JEPI, which is JP Morgan's Equity Premium Income ETF. Now, something that you might not know is that JP Morgan Chase Bank is actually a custodian of those JEPI assets, which means that they manage those JEPI assets. The question that falls in our mind is that what will happen to those JEPI assets if JP Morgan Chase Bank collapses? So one of the things that happens in bankruptcy is the liquidation of the things you manage in order to pay off your creditors. Now, what JP Morgan Chase Bank has right now are depositors, right? People like me and you who gets our paycheck direct deposited into our bank, which is JP Morgan and Chase. So what will happen if JP Morgan actually flops? Well, those depositors are now creditors. And what creditors do is that they will do everything in their power to liquidate everything, any asset that JP Morgan manages. And remember what I just said about those JEPI assets. Who manages them? That's right, JP Morgan. So we can learn a lot from Statement of Additional Information, and here's the one for JP Morgan. If you go and look for custodian, which should exist for every Statement of Additional Information for ETFs, you will find who the custodian is. In this case, it's JP Morgan and Chase Bank, which serves as the custodian and fund accounting agent for each fund. Pursuant to the JP Morgan custody agreement, they're responsible for holding portfolio securities and cash and maintaining the books of account and records of portfolio transactions. Now, the custodian services are pretty incredible. Beginning December 1, 2022, JP Morgan Chase Bank will be paid annual safekeeping fees, just fees for holding your money, of between 0.0004% and 0.5% of the fund's assets held by JP Morgan Chase Bank. So taking a look at this, the AUM, the assets under management, is basically 26.4 billion, right? If we take that, times that by the 0.0004%, you get basically 105,000. Doesn't seem like a lot, right? But that's between 0.0004% and 0.5%. If it's 0.5%, they're basically making $132.4 million just by holding money. Can I get that job? So what you're seeing here is another example. This is SCHD, which is by Schwab, and you can see that their custodian and fund account is State Street, right? It's a completely different bank, but with JP Morgan's ETF using JP Morgan, oh man, it just seems funny. So from the looks of it, it just seems like things aren't very transparent to me. I mean, we have JP Morgan ETFs, their custodian is JP Morgan Chase Bank. So it really feels like, I don't know, JP Morgan Chase Bank is paying themselves. That's how it looks like. But you can be assured that each ETF is by itself a separate company, which makes it feel like they are separate and have no links to JP Morgan. Except this. So if you go to Statement of Additional Information again and search for Investment Advisor, you'll find this Officers section. So the trust executive officers generally are employees of the advisor or one of its affiliates, and they conduct and supervise the business operations of the trust. And all of these officers, if you've noticed, they all have links to JP Morgan. Managing director, their JP Morgan Investment Management, and a lot of them has been with, for example, JP Morgan Chase since 2010, and Stephen Ungerman has been with JP Morgan Chase since 2000. Now, need I not remind you that I am not a financial advisor of any sort. I am a YouTuber that studied software engineering in school, but from the looks of it, it looks like JP Morgan ETFs have a very close connection with the bank itself, which I don't feel like that is right. I don't think that they're supposed to have very close connections other than custodian duties. What seems right is with SCHD, for example, using State Street instead of Charles Schwab, right? Because Charles Schwab also have a bank themselves, but SCHD decided to go with another bank for their custodian services. But why didn't JP Morgan do that? So those are questions we need to ask. Does JP Morgan have the money necessary to pay back all depositors if all depositors came at one time to ask for their money back? 100% not, because our banks in America operate on a fractional banking system, which means that banks are only required to have a minimum of 10% of the money that is deposited into the bank. So what that means is that for every $100 you deposit into the bank, what JP Morgan can do is that they only have to keep 10% of that in the bank, which is $10. The other 90%, which is $90, can actually be lent out to borrowers. So when you go and ask for your money back, if you all went to JP Morgan and asked for our money back, they will need to recover that $90 that they lent out to borrowers. And if the borrowers can't pay them back, that means that the only money that JP Morgan has that can pay you back is that $10. And you're only gonna get that $10 back if you're lucky. So here is JP Morgan Chase's balance sheet ending 22. They had $3.6 trillion ending 22 and $882 billion. That is the important number because that is what is liquid. So after that, we take a look at their total deposits, which is part of their liabilities. That is how much depositors deposit to JP Morgan Chase. And it totaled $2.34 trillion. So that means if we divided 882 billion by 2.34 trillion, they can only cover 38% of the deposits ending 22. Does that sound safe to you? So up to this point, I've been pretty negative about things. Luckily, we can ask ChatGPT questions to make us feel better. So I asked ChatGPT, ETFs and JP Morgan ETFs are custodied by JP Morgan. If JP Morgan collapses, can they liquidate the trust in order to pay their creditors? And fortunately, ChatGPT was way more positive about things because for them, it would be unlikely that the bank would be able to directly liquidate the ETF trust in order to pay their creditors. Assets held within an ETF are intended to be separated and segregated from the custodian's own assets and liabilities. In the event of a JP Morgan's collapse, it is more likely that the assets held within the ETF trust would be protected from being directly liquidated to pay the bank's creditors. The ETFs would remain the property of their investors, separate from JP Morgan's own bankruptcy proceedings. So the good news is it looks like we're safe. Well, maybe. When I asked ChatGPT about it, ChatGPT said I have to be vigilant because there are scenarios where the assets of an ETF can actually be subject to the claims of creditors. And of course, looking at the statement of additional information, I can't find anything related to that scenario. So at the end of the day, we have to be vigilant. So the chances of JP Morgan failing, which is the US's main guard dog when it comes to the commercial banking system, is literally slim to none, because if JP Morgan fails, that can basically signify the end to the US empire. And if that happens, because of how interconnected everything is in the global banking system, there's going to be much bigger things to worry about than your investment in JEPI or what you have on your JP Morgan Chase bank account. So what I think is, until then, investing in JEPI is actually really safe. And if you're investing in JEPI, you should also take a look at its sister fund, JEPQ, which I also made a video and you can find that here.